are standing in front of the wrong.
Commander, the situation is clear. If you proceed, we will respond.
The hegemony of the Ascended had done this 47 times. They had a system, a process. It was clean, efficient, and almost polite, the way a surgeon is polite when they tell you that you need an operation, not cruel, just sure of itself. The hegemony would arrive at the edge of a new star system, observe, profile, calculate, and then send an envoy. The envoy would explain in careful language how things were going to go from now on. Most species cried. Some begged. A few fought briefly, the way small animals fight when they already know how it ends. None of them had ever surprised the hegemony. That was the thing about the hegemony. They were never surprised. So when the long-range survey drones returned data on a small blue planet in the outer rim, a planet with radio signals, orbital stations, primitive faster-than-light capability, and what appeared to be a genuinely chaotic political structure, the grand strategist, Vorithkai, reviewed the file with the same mild interest he gave to all of them. He was a tall creature, Vorithkai, gray-skinned, four-armed, with eyes that had seen the quiet surrender of 11 civilizations personally. He had a reputation for being thorough, for being, above all things, unbothered. He read the file on humanity twice. Then he put it down and said, "Standard annexation, 3 planetary cycles." His aide asked if he wanted a deeper analysis. "No," said Vorithkai. "They're soft-bodied, no hive mind, no natural armor. Their largest political structures actively argue with each other. Their military forces are," he glanced at the number, "minimal at current count. Send an envoy, be civil." The envoy ship was the eternal consideration. A beautiful vessel, white and silver, shaped like a crescent, designed specifically for first-contact situations. It carried diplomats, translators, xenosociologists, and a very small security detail, because sending a warship to a first contact was considered rude, even by the hegemony's standards. Ambassador Lena Vasquez met them at the orbital station above Earth. She was 5 feet 4 inches tall. She had gray-streaked hair pulled back in a knot that had been neat 6 hours ago and wasn't anymore. She was holding a thermos of coffee that smelled, to the hegemony's translator drones, like burnt organic matter. She smiled when the envoy delegation came through the airlock. Not a nervous smile, not a diplomatic, practiced smile. Just a smile, like she was genuinely pleased to see them. "Welcome," she said, "long trip." The lead envoy, a xenosociologist named Euryteth, spent 3 seconds processing that question. In 47 first contacts, no planetary representative had ever asked about the comfort of the journey. "It was adequate," Euryteth said carefully. "Good," Vasquez gestured toward the meeting room. "We have food inside. I don't know what you eat, so we made a few things. If none of it works for you, just say so and we'll figure something out." Euryteth filed that detail in a mental folder. She labeled behavioral anomalies and followed the small human into the station. The meeting went smoothly. Vasquez listened to everything the hegemony delegation said. She asked clear questions. She took notes on a physical paper pad with a pen, which Euryteth found oddly charming. She did not panic. She did not weep. She did not make any speeches about freedom or sovereignty, which, in Euryteth's experience, always came before the weeping. She pushed the snack tray toward them twice. At the end of the first session, when the hegemony delegation had laid out the framework of what they were calling a mutual integration agreement, Vasquez clicked her pen and looked at the table for a moment. "I'll need to bring this back to our governing bodies," she said. "There's a process." Euryteth nodded. "Of course. It'll take a few weeks, maybe a month." Vasquez stood, stretched her lower back with a small wince. "In the meantime, I assume you'll want to continue your surveys." "Standard procedure," Euryteth confirmed. "Fine by us." Vasquez picked up her thermos. One thing though, just as a courtesy, we'll need to notify our reserve systems. Let them know what's happening. Procedure on our end. Urateth nodded again, made a small note. Reserve systems, likely administrative. Domestic communications. Of course, she said. Later, on the eternal consideration, she compiled her initial profile of the species. Soft bodies, high social warmth, disorganized governance, minimal active military presence, a strange, almost aggressive habit of offering food to strangers. She labeled the file, low resistance probability. She transmitted it to Vorothkai. He read it, approved it, and moved on to other things. The hegemony had 12 other operations running. Humanity was the smallest, the simplest, the most routine. Nobody in that meeting room had noticed anything odd. Nobody had thought to ask exactly what Vasquez meant by reserve systems. Nobody had asked about the word notify, whether it meant inform or whether it meant activate. The survey drones continued their scans of the Sol system. They counted orbital platforms, population centers, energy outputs. They measured the human military's active strength, confirmed it was the number Vasquez had cited. Small, manageable. They measured everything. They did not measure the footlockers. Far below, on a blue-green planet that smelled like salt water and old fires, something moved in the infrastructure of 100 nations. Not loudly, not visibly. A signal here, a database query there. A handshake between systems that had been sleeping, waiting, built years ago for exactly this kind of situation, and then carefully, quietly left on standby. In a barn in Saskatchewan, a phone lit up. In an apartment in Osaka, a bag that had always been packed sat by the door. In Sao Paulo, a woman who had not worn a uniform in 11 years opened a closet and stood in front of it for a moment. On Earth, nothing looked different. The survey drone saw the same cities, the same roads, the same quiet blue planet. The drones were looking at the surface. They weren't watching what was happening underneath it. And in the orbital station, Ambassador Vasquez poured another cup of terrible coffee, sat down with her notes, and began drafting a message to the UN Security Council. The subject line was simple. They're here, notify everyone. Everyone meant something different to Vasquez than it meant to the hegemony. The hegemony thought everyone meant diplomats, council members, heads of state. Vasquez meant every person on the reserve registry going back 40 years. She hit send. Then she leaned back in her chair, looked out at the crescent-shaped ship floating in the dark outside her window, and drank her coffee. She didn't look afraid. She didn't look angry. She looked like a woman who had just started a clock and knew exactly how much time was on it. The hegemony had done this 47 times. They had never done it to something that had been waiting. Sarathul was known for two things. The first was her composure. In 6 years of hegemony intelligence work, she had read files that would make most people stop eating for a week, and she had done it with the flat, careful expression of someone doing light administrative tasks. Her commanding officer called her unshakable. Her colleagues called her cold. She considered both words compliments. The second thing she was known for was being thorough. That was the thing that got her into trouble. When the assignment came through, routine threat assessment addendum for the new Outer Rim contact, she took it the way she took all assignments. Sat down, opened the file, started at the beginning. Most analysts skimmed. Sarathul read every entry, every footnote, every archived data packet the survey drones had pulled from the planet's own public networks. The humans had an enormous amount of public records, an almost alarming amount. They documented everything. Wars, famines, political collapses, natural disasters, all of it written down, uploaded, cross-referenced, argued about in public forums that were still accessible. She started with the current era, peaceful, low military activity, consistent with the initial profile. She went back 50 years, then 100, then further. The file she opened was labeled, in the Human Archive's own categorization, World War II, 1939–1945. She read it. Then she sat very still for a moment. Then she read it again. The numbers were the first thing. The hegemony had a mathematical model for what level of casualties would break a species' collective will to fight. It had been tested, validated, refined across 47 civilizations. It was reliable. The model had a name, the fracture threshold. Every species had one. The model's basic assumption, proven repeatedly, was that any social organism facing losses above a certain percentage of its population would enter a survival preservation mode. It would stop fighting. It would negotiate. It would do whatever was necessary to stop the bleeding. World War II had pushed multiple human nations past the fracture threshold. They had not stopped. They had, by all documented evidence, accelerated. Sarathul flagged it as anomalous, moved on. Maybe it was an outlier. Maybe those specific conflicts had unique factors. She kept reading. Korea, a conflict where one human faction fought another human faction's war for them, for reasons that were mostly ideological, on terrain that was actively hostile, with supply lines stretched to their limit, and continued fighting for 3 years past any rational cost-benefit endpoint. Vietnam, a conflict where a technologically superior force fought a smaller, less equipped one, and the smaller force simply did not stop, did not reorganize, did not concede, just kept existing in the conflict, absorbing losses, adapting tactics, until the larger force's own population lost the will to continue. The smaller force hadn't won by defeating the enemy's army. It had won by outlasting the enemy's patience. Sarathul had no category for that. She built one, filed it under temporal attrition, requires further study. She kept reading. The resource wars of the early 21st century, the consolidation conflicts, a dozen smaller engagements that didn't have grand names, just coordinates and body counts. Each one showed the same geometry. Humans didn't fight clean. They didn't fight according to the expected arc of escalation and resolution. They burrowed into conflicts. They adapted mid-fight. They changed the rules of the engagement when the rules stopped working for them. And they did it fast, sometimes within days of encountering a new problem. One particular entry stopped her. A small conflict, a footnote compared to the larger wars. A human force of roughly 15,000 soldiers had been surrounded, cut off from supply lines, facing an opposing force of more than 100,000. By every rational military metric, they should have surrendered within 48 hours. The math was clear. The situation was unwinnable. They held for 11 days. They improvised weapons from what they had. They rationed supplies in ways that should not have functionally worked. They used the terrain in ways their enemy hadn't anticipated. They took losses that would have shattered units from any of the 47 hegemony cataloged species, and they kept going. They hadn't won. Eventually they were relieved by another force. But they hadn't stopped, either. They just kept existing in the fight until the situation changed. Sarathul sat back in her chair. The hegemony had a classification for species that fought beyond rational self-preservation. They called them broken ones, a category that meant a civilization had suffered some psychological fracture, some deep collective wound that removed normal survival instincts. It was considered a tragedy, a pathology. Broken ones were dangerous but ultimately self-defeating. They burned bright and collapsed. She looked at the human timeline. Thousands of years of conflict, recurring, adaptive, they had never collapsed. They weren't broken ones. The broken ones fought like this because something inside them had died. Humans fought like this as their baseline. She stood up, got water, stood at the small window of her office and looked at the stars for a while. Then she went back and kept reading. It took her 4 more days to reach the end of the archive. By the end of the second day, she had stopped sleeping in any meaningful way, not from fear exactly, but from the kind of alertness that comes when a pattern becomes too big to look away from. By the end of the third day, she had 43 new classification categories, all of them filed under human-specific, no current parallel. On the fourth day, she found the phrase. It was in a collection of documented soldier communications, things said before battles, things said in the worst moments of the worst engagements. Researchers had compiled them, the way humans compiled everything carefully with footnotes and context. Most of the phrases made sense to her, for the people behind us. Don't let them through, make them pay for every step. She understood those. Then she found the one that broke her classification system. Hold until relieved. She ran it through the translator twice. The output was the same, not hold or die, not hold or face consequences, not even hold because there's no other option. Hold until relieved, until someone comes, until the situation changes, until help arrives. It was an instruction built on the assumption that someone was coming. That humans were never, in their own mental model of a fight, truly alone. She thought about the scale of what she'd been reading, the number of simultaneous conflicts, the geographic spread, the number of individual soldiers operating in isolated conditions in hostile terrain. Somewhere in the back of all of it was the belief that someone was coming. She closed the file. Then she opened a new document and started writing. The report was 340 pages. She was not proud of the length. Good intelligence was supposed to be concise, but she could not find a shorter way to say what she needed to say without losing something important. The summary, though, was 4 words. She looked at those 4 words for a long time before she submitted the report. Do not touch them. She attached the full 340 pages. She flagged it urgent. She sent it directly to Vorothkai's desk, bypassing the normal routing chain, which was a violation of protocol that could get her reprimanded. She sent it anyway. Then she waited. Vorothkai's response came back in 40 minutes. Noted, annexation proceeds as scheduled. Your thoroughness is appreciated, but the operational decision is final. Sarathul read that twice. Then she looked out at the stars again, at the small yellow star in the distance that the humans called their sun, and felt something she almost never felt. She felt afraid. Not of the humans exactly. Of the fact that somewhere on that planet, a notification had gone out. And whatever reserve systems meant, whatever was waking up in the infrastructure of 100 nations, it had not woken up because the humans were panicking. It had woken up because someone had asked it to. Calmly, with a thermos of terrible coffee in hand, Sarathul pulled up Vasquez's file, read it once, looked at the photo, a small, gray-haired woman with tired eyes and a smile that meant something Sarathul was only just beginning to understand. The smile wasn't warmth. Well, it was warmth, but it was also something else. It was the smile of someone who already knows how the next part goes. The UN Security Council meeting lasted 9 hours. It was not orderly. 3 nations argued for compliance. 4 argued for negotiation from a position of submission. 2 wanted to stall. 1 representative walked out, came back, walked out again. There was shouting. There was a moment, somewhere around hour 6, when 2 ambassadors had to be physically separated by the people sitting between them. The hegemony observer drones, watching the live feed, recorded everything and filed a report that said, in clinical language, governing structure shows signs of fracture. Internal disagreement at critical decision point suggests low cohesion. Resistance probability further downgraded. They were watching the argument. They weren't watching what the argument was actually doing. Because this was the thing about humans that no outside observer had ever quite understood. The argument was the decision. The shouting and the walking out and the coming back and the slamming of papers on tables, this was not dysfunction. This was the machine running. And when it finished running, 9 hours later, with a vote that was not unanimous, not clean, not impressive looking, it produced a decision. The decision was 2 words. We resist. The reserve activation protocol had not been triggered in 40 years. It was not a simple system. It had been built, revised, reinforced, tested, and maintained by 17 successive generations of military planners across 100 nations, each of them adding layers, redundancies, safeguards. Not because they expected this specific situation, because humans built contingencies for things that hadn't happened yet. It was almost a compulsion. The protocol could not be stopped by any single government. That was by design. Too many hands had built it. Too many systems depended on it. It was woven into infrastructure the way load-bearing walls are woven into a building. You could not remove it without the whole structure noticing. The signal went out at 4:17 a.m. Greenwich time. Not a broadcast, not an alarm, just a cascade of quiet notifications moving through a network that looked, from the outside, like routine administrative traffic. A phone lit up in a barn in Saskatchewan. The man who owned the barn was named Marcus Webb. He was 53 years old. He had been farming for 22 years. He had a dog, 2 grown children, and a footlocker in the corner of his barn that he had not opened since 2031. He read the notification. He finished the row he was planting, because leaving a row unfinished bothered him more than most things. Then he went to the barn and opened the footlocker. Everything fit. He had made a point every few years of checking. He sent a message to his daughter that said, "Going to be away for a bit. Feed the dog." In Osaka, a woman named Yui Mori was teaching 2nd grade on Monday through Friday and living a completely separate life that none of her students, neighbors, or friends from the last 12 years had ever seen. The bag by her door had been packed for those 12 years. She picked it up, apologized to her cat, and locked the apartment. She did not look like someone walking into anything. She looked like someone who had already thought through everything that was about to happen and made peace with it. In Sao Paulo, General, retired, Clara Okonkwo was already on the phone before the notification arrived. She had a network. She had been keeping it warm for years, not because she expected anything, but because that was what you did when you'd spent 30 years learning how fast things could change. She made 17 calls in 40 minutes. 17 people made calls of their own. The tree grew fast. In orbit, the Hegemony Fleet Commander, a broad, heavily built creature named Vasthane who had run 14 successful annexations and considered himself a practical, experienced officer, was watching his surface scan data with a small frown. Something was moving. Not armies, nothing that obvious, just movement. A million small vectors converging towards staging points he hadn't mapped yet, supply chains activating, transport logistics shifting, the planet's civilian infrastructure quietly reorganizing itself around a new center of gravity. He requested an updated population analysis from his intelligence team. The analyst who brought him the report was young, new. She set the tablet on his desk without looking at him, which was how he knew the numbers were bad. Active duty count remains consistent with initial survey, she said. Vasthane felt the but before she said it. However, she cleared her throat. Active duty figures don't include reserve classification tiers 1 through 7. How many tiers are there? 7. Vasthane looked at the tablet. What is tier 7? Anyone who has ever completed basic military training and is currently alive. The room was quiet. Give me the combined number, Vasthane said. The analyst had known this moment was coming since she first ran the calculation. She had checked it 3 times. She had been hopping in the way that people hope for errors in bad news, that she had made a mistake. She hadn't made a mistake. She told him the number. Vasthane looked at the surface scan feed for a long moment. The blue-green planet, the thin white swirl of clouds, the glittering necklace of orbital stations. It all looked exactly the same as it had this morning. "That's not possible," he said, not angrily, just the honest response of a man whose models had no room for that number. "Sir," the analyst said carefully, "the number is still going up." He looked at her. "Mobilization isn't complete," she said. "The notification went out less than 12 hours ago. The count is it's still climbing." Vasthane put the tablet down very carefully, the way you put something down when you don't want the sound of it hitting the desk to give away what you're thinking. He thought about Sarathul's report. He had received it third hand, summarized, flagged as overcautious by 2 senior analysts before it reached him. He had read the summary. He had not read the full 340 pages. He thought about the forward summary. "Do not touch them." He had dismissed it as the product of an analyst who had been staring at archives too long and built phantom threats from historical data. It happened. Good analysts sometimes lost perspective. He looked at the number on the tablet. He thought about Vasquez, the small woman with the thermos, the smile. "We'll need to notify our reserve systems." She had said it so gently, so offhand, like she was mentioning she needed to send an email. He pulled up the communication logs from the first contact meeting. He found the moment, listened to it again, this time without the context of a routine first contact. Notify. Not inform, not update. Notify. He sat in his command chair for a long time after that. Outside his ship in the orbital dark, the planet continued its slow rotation. The scan feeds continued their updates. The number continued to climb. And somewhere in a barn in Saskatchewan, a man named Marcus Webb was checking that everything still fit, because he had a feeling, the same feeling he'd had twice before in his life, that he was about to need all of it. The hegemony had arrived expecting a soft landing. What they were watching now, in real time on their own sensors, was something they did not have a word for. Not an army mobilizing. Not a civilization panicking. Just a species remembering what it was. And the number kept going up. The hegemony fleet moved on Sol on a Tuesday. 40 warships, the rightful order class, the hegemony's standard annexation fleet configuration, tested and optimized across 14 operations. Enough firepower to reduce a planetary defense grid to debris in 6 hours. Enough troop capacity to hold 3 major population centers simultaneously. Vasthane had run the engagement model the night before, and the model said the same thing it always said. Overwhelming force projection produces rapid compliance. He moved on Sol anyway, because the order had come from Vorith Kai, and because stopping now would require explaining to the grand strategist that a number on a tablet had frightened him. He told himself it was just a number. The first engagement lasted 4 hours. Not because the human forces were strong enough to sustain a 4-hour fight. They weren't. On paper, the human forces defending the outer orbital perimeter were outgunned by a ratio that should have ended the engagement in 40 minutes. Vasthane had seen that ratio before. He knew what it looked like when it played out. What he had not seen before was what happened at the 30-minute mark. The human forces stopped defending the perimeter. They just left it, pulled back, dispersed, dissolved into 100 small signatures moving in 100 different directions. And when Vasthane concentrated his fleet to pursue the largest grouping, they split again. Smaller, faster, moving in patterns that his tactical system kept trying to classify and kept failing to. Not a retreat. A retreat had a direction away from the threat toward safety. This had no direction. It had geometry. They were moving into positions, not random, but the positions didn't make sense yet, the way a word doesn't make sense until you have all the letters. "They're not fighting us," his tactical officer said, with the confused tone of someone narrating something they don't fully understand. "No," Vosthane said, "they're costing us time." That was when it started to feel different. Because time was not something the hegemony had priced into their model. Time was the one resource they always had more of than anyone else. They were a 47 civilization empire. They could sustain a siege for years, decades. The idea that a small, outgunned outer rim species could make time a meaningful variable. His sensor array lit up. 3 human vessels had come out of the dark on his port side, not from Saul, from the belt further out, and hit one of his supply chain ships before his defensive grid could rotate to cover it. The supply ship didn't go down, but it burned. It burned bright enough that every hegemony ship in the fleet saw it. The 3 human vessels were gone before he could respond. "Where did those come from?" he asked. Nobody had a good answer. Over the next 6 hours, it happened 7 more times. Never a direct engagement, never a stand-up fight. Just shapes in the dark, moving in and out, hitting soft spots and disappearing. His fleet was not taking serious damage, but it was being touched over and over in ways it had no template for. He thought about the archive files, the surrounded force of 15,000, the 11 days. Sarathul watched the battle feeds from the command deck of the silent analysis. The intelligence vessel stationed 2,000 kilometers behind the main fleet. She had not been sleeping well. She pulled up the engagement data, spread it across 3 screens, and started mapping the human movement vectors. After 20 minutes, she stopped mapping and just looked at what she'd drawn. She recognized it. Not the specific battle, but the shape of it, the geometry of how forces this small stretched forces this large, the way a small force could impose cost on a larger one not by fighting it, but by forcing it to keep looking over its shoulder. She had read this exact approach in the archives. Multiple times, different centuries, different wars, different human factions fighting each other with it, inventing it over and over. They had a dozen names for it. The principle was always the same. You don't match their strength. You match their attention span. She opened her comm channel to Commander Vosthane. "Sir, I want to share something from the historical file." His response was short and not especially polite. "Not now, Sarathul." "Sir, they're using a documented tactical framework. I've identified the pattern. If I'm right about what comes next." "If you're right, you can say so in the post-operation debrief." The channel closed. She sat back. He wasn't wrong to be busy. The battle was live. She understood the calculus. She looked at her map of the human movement vectors again. If the pattern held, and the archive gave her very high confidence that the pattern would hold, the current phase was not the fight. It was the loosening. The stage where a smaller force picks at a larger one's organization, its supply lines, its cohesion, its certainty not to win, but to soften the shape of how the larger force thinks about the space around it. The fight came after the loosening. She looked at the outer edge of her sensor map. The deep space buoys that marked the boundary of the Sol system were still transmitting clean data. Nothing beyond them, just dark. She looked at that dark for a long time. The hegemony's war council met aboard the flagship 3 days into the operation. Vosthane presented the engagement data. The council listened. The mood was not panicked. The hegemony was not in the habit of panic, but it was tight. The kind of tight that comes when something is not going the way it's supposed to go. "We're taking minimal casualties," the logistics commander said. "The engagement is prolonged but not unsustainable." "The problem," Vosthane said carefully, "is that the engagement is still prolonging." He pulled up the mobilization data. The counter that had been climbing since the first notification went out. It was still climbing. "Every day we spend in this engagement," he said, They have more people dressed and ready. The council reviewed the numbers. An older commander, Vethon, 22 years of operational experience, made a sound that wasn't quite a word. "What are they mobilizing for?" she asked. "Our force is here. They're not mobilizing toward our fleet." "No," Vosthane said, "they're not." A junior analyst, new, not yet trained out of the habit of saying obvious things out loud, raised her hand. "If they're not mobilizing toward the fleet," she said, "where are they going?" The council looked at each other. Nobody had an answer. The prisoner was an older man. A scar ran from his jaw to his ear in a line that looked deliberate, not a combat injury. Something older, something else. He sat in the hegemony holding room with the specific stillness of a person who has been in small, hostile rooms before and learned not to waste energy on them. The hegemony interrogation officer, junior grade by the book, went through the standard protocol, offered terms, explained the situation, laid out clearly and politely that resistance was futile and cooperation was in the prisoner's best interest. The man looked at the terms document, looked at the officer. "You should leave," he said. The officer blinked. "I'm sorry." "Not you personally." The man glanced at the sailing, a gesture that seemed to mean the fleet, the hegemony, the whole thing. "All of you, you should leave, soon, while it's still a decision you can make for yourself." The officer processed this. "Is that a threat?" "No." The man looked at him with an expression that was patient without being kind. "It's directions. There's a difference." He didn't say anything else after that. No speeches, no explanations. Just sat in the same particular stillness, and eventually the officer left, because there was nothing more to be extracted from a man who had decided exactly how much he was going to say and had already said all of it. At 300 hours ship time, the Deep Space Early Warning Array began returning anomalous contacts. Not from Sol. Vosthane was on the command deck in 4 minutes. He looked at the data for a long time. He made himself look at it slowly, because fast-looking sometimes missed things. He had not missed anything. The contacts were behind them. Not behind them in the sense of Sol being at their back, behind them in the sense of hegemony space, their own territory, their supply lines, the 17 star systems between here and home. Something was moving through hegemony space. Many somethings. He thought about Vasquez and the thermos and the notification. He thought about what the mobilization counter had been measuring, and the thing nobody at the War Council had answered. If they weren't mobilizing toward the fleet. He looked at the contacts. He had his answer. They hadn't mobilized toward the hegemony fleet. They had mobilized around it. The humans in Sol hadn't been fighting. They had been keeping the fleet busy, keeping its attention forward, keeping its sensors focused on the engagement, while something moved through the dark spaces on the other side. The old man's voice came back to him. "You should leave, soon, while it's still a decision you can make for yourself." Vosthane looked at the contacts on his screen, looked at the number of them, looked at where they were positioned. He reached for his communication console. He had some calls to make. The question was whether he still had time to make them. The hegemony's retreat was disciplined. That was the thing that surprised people later when historians wrote about it, that even in those first days of real shock, the hegemony fleet held together. Vosthane was a competent commander. He understood what had happened, not all of it, not the full picture, but enough. He issued the withdrawal order without drama. He didn't call it a retreat in the official log. He called it a tactical reorientation. But the direction was clear, back, away from Sol, back toward home space. The problem was that home space had changed. The contacts on the deep space array were not a flanking force. They were not a harassing force. When Vosthane got his first complete sensor picture of what was moving through hegemony territory, he sat with it for a very long time before he shared it with anyone. It was a siege formation. not around a single point, around a volume of space. 12 star systems, the critical infrastructure backbone of the hegemony's outer territories, the shipyards, the supply depots, the relay stations that kept the empire's communication network alive. All of it enclosed not by walls but by presence. Human ships, human stations, human positions that had materialized in the dark like they had been waiting there for a long time. Because some of them had. That was the part that kept Vosthane awake. Not that they had moved fast, though they had moved fast, faster than any mobilization he had modeled, but that not all of it had moved at all. Some of it had been there already. Quietly. Prepositioned. In the spaces between hegemony stars that the hegemony had surveyed and found empty and classified as void. They had found them empty, because humans were very good at being quiet when they needed to be. He called for his senior strategist, Vethon, and showed her the map. She looked at it for a while. They built contingencies, she said, not as a complaint, almost with a kind of professional recognition. For us, Vosthane asked. Vethon shook her head slowly. Not for us specifically, for something like us. She traced one of the position clusters with her finger. This positioning doesn't account for our specific fleet configuration. It accounts for a type of threat, a large force coming from this direction. She moved her hand. This cluster accounts for a force coming from this direction. She pulled back from the map. They built for the general case, years ago, maybe decades. Vosthane thought about Sarathul's report, the 4 words. Do not touch them. The 340 pages he had never read. Get me a channel to the intelligence vessel, he said quietly. Sarathul did not say I told you so. She was better than that. She was also, by this point, operating on 4 hours of sleep over 3 days, which had smoothed out the part of her that might have wanted to. She looked at the map Vosthane shared with her. She looked at the position clusters. She looked at the siege geometry. Then she said, we need to talk to Vasquez. I know, Vosthane said. Before this gets worse. I know. There was a pause. Sir, how much worse can it get? Vosthane looked at his own sensor screens, at the human formations, at the supply lines they were sitting on, at the communication relays they were adjacent to but had not yet cut. I don't know, he said. That's the problem. The communication request went to Ambassador Vasquez through the same diplomatic channel they had used at the beginning. The channel that had been used for polite introductions and offers of snacks, and the careful, civil language of a meeting that was supposed to be the beginning of a straightforward annexation. Vasquez answered in 40 seconds. She was at her desk. The thermos was there. She looked the same as she had at the first meeting, a little tired, a little practical, not performing anything. She had a notepad in front of her with handwriting on it that the feed wasn't high resolution enough to read. Ambassador, Sarathul said, she had taken the call, it felt right. She had been the one who read the files. Thank you for. You want to talk about next steps, Vasquez said, not rudely, just clearly. Yes. All right, Vasquez clicked her pen, go ahead. Sarathul looked at her notes. She had prepared 3 opening gambits. She abandoned all of them. We would like to discuss terms for a ceasefire, she said. Vasquez nodded. We are prepared to withdraw our fleet from the Sol system completely. We are prepared to recognize Earth's sovereignty and the sovereignty of all associated human settlements. Sarathul paused. We ask only that the forces currently positioned in our territory stand down and return to human space. Vasquez wrote something on her notepad. That's a reasonable starting point, she said. We can negotiate additional terms. Before we get to terms, Vasquez said, I need you to understand something, so we're starting from the same place. She set the pen down. The forces you're looking at in your territory right now are reserve forces, Tier 3 and below mostly. People who got a notification on their phone 2 weeks ago and went and got their old gear out. Sarathul felt the shape of what was coming before Vasquez said it. We haven't touched the standing military, Vasquez said. Her voice was not cold. It was the voice of a doctor telling you the full picture because you need the full picture. What you engaged in saw, that was people who used to be soldiers, farmers, teachers, people who hadn't held a weapon in 20 years and picked one up because we asked them to. Silence on the channel. The standing military hasn't moved, Vasquez continued. It won't move if this ends here. Sarathul looked at the formations on her screen, the siege that had materialized from the dark, the positions that had been waiting, maybe for years, for something like this. What is your standing military? She asked. Vasquez looked at her for a moment. Something we hope you never have to find out about. She picked up the pen again. Now terms. The terms took 6 days to negotiate. They were, by the standards of every hegemony annexation ever reversed, extraordinarily mild. Humanity did not ask for territory, did not ask for reparations, did not demand access to hegemony shipyards or technology or resources. The Hegemony Council, reviewing the draft in their chamber on the Rightful Order flagship, went over it 3 times looking for the hidden costs. There were no hidden costs. Humans asked for one thing: an open signal corridor, a communication channel free, unmonitored, accessible to any civilization under hegemony control, the right of those civilizations to talk to each other. Just talk. The Hegemony Council called a recess to debate it. Vethon, who had been in the room for the full 6 days of negotiation, stepped outside with Sarathul. Why do they want this? Vethon asked. They could ask for so much more. Sarathul thought about the archive files, the long history, the pattern she had found running through all of it. They didn't fight for territory, she said. Then what did they fight for? Sarathul looked at the corridor wall. At the hegemony's sigil embossed there, a closed ring, the symbol of a completed, contained empire. Something smaller than them got stepped on, she said. Vethon looked at her. 47 civilizations, Sarathul said. That's what we did. We stepped on 47 civilizations, and humanity read about it. She paused. They want those species to be able to talk to each other, to us. They want the ring to have a crack in it. That's all. That's everything. Sarathul looked back at the negotiation room. This isn't the end. The corridor is just the beginning of a much longer thing. They know that. They're patient. They went back inside. The hegemony signed. 3 months later, in the lower archives of the hegemony's Central Documentation Authority, a junior historian named SYL was compiling the official record. She needed a conflict designation, standard protocol. Every military engagement had one, a formal hegemony name, pulled from the approved list, weighted toward terms that conveyed the empire's dignity even in cases of unfavorable outcomes. She pulled the approved list, found 7 options. They were all fine, formal, correct. She looked at the human side communication logs first, the way she always looked at primary sources before picking a name. The human soldiers had a name for it. They had used it consistently across every recorded communication, from the first engagement to the ceasefire. Not an official designation, it didn't appear in any human military documentation she could find. It was just what the people doing the fighting called it, among themselves, in the way soldiers always name the thing they're living through before the historians get to it. The wake up. She looked at that for a long time. No irony in it. No triumph. They hadn't named it after the enemy or the victory or even after Earth. They had named it after what it had done to them. She thought about everything in the file. The farmer in Saskatchewan, the teacher in Osaka, the millions of ordinary people who had simply remembered what they were when someone asked them to. And somewhere beyond the edge of human space, past the reserves, past the formations that had come out of the dark, something that Ambassador Vasquez had declined to describe, something that hadn't moved, that didn't need to. Something we hope you never have to find out about. SY looked at the approved designation list for another few seconds. Then she closed it. She typed 2 words into the official record. Filed it unchanged. The hegemony of the Ascended had absorbed 47 civilizations. It had never been woken up before. It would be a long time before it made that mistake again.